Hello and welcome to Tenant Action Today, brought to you by Met Council on Housing, the citywide tenants union, and brought to you by Manhattan Neighborhood Network. My name is Michael McKee. I am a member of Met Council on Housing, and I'm also the treasurer of the Tenants Political Action Committee. On this program, we're going to be talking about something really historic. Just last week, the Rent Guidelines Board in Kingston, New York, voted to roll back rents for rent stabilized apartments by 15%. This is the first time in the history of the rent stabilization system in New York State that any rent guidelines board has actually reduced rents. We're going to be talking with members of the Kingston Rent Guidelines Board. We're going to be talking with some community organizers in Kingston, New York, and we're going to be talking with a member of the Kingston Common Council. Our first guests are three organizers from two different organizations. One organization is For the Many, and the other is the Citizen Action of New York. Bravin, Tyler, and June, welcome. So this is quite an exciting victory. I hope you guys are as pumped as I am.
Yeah, extremely excited. This was a huge victory. Hard to still grapple with it, I think. We're still now just trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next now that we've won this
Right.
huge for tenants?
Well, first we have to win in court, but that's another matter. Yeah. So Kingston was the first municipality to opt into the state rent regulation system after we got the law changed 3 years ago to allow upstate municipalities to opt in. Before that, they were prohibited by state law. And we know from what everything we've read and heard that even before the law was changed 3 years ago, there was a lot of rent pressure, rising rents, and pressure on the market in Kingston. So tell us about the early days of the campaign leading up to persuading the Common Council to vote to opt into the Emergency Tenant Protection Act.
Yeah, Robin, you want to take it?
Yeah, I mean, we've been engaged around housing issues in Kingston for years now. Earlier this year, we worked with Tyler and some of our other allies to pass good cause eviction, making Kingston only the fourth municipality in the state to do so. And we heard again and again from tenants that were saying the same thing, right? Their rents kept skyrocketing. There wasn't enough housing for them, and they were having to make really painstaking decisions between putting food on the table or affording their health care and being able to afford to stay in their homes. And so we knew there was a housing emergency in Kingston, and we have a relationship with the mayor's office, especially his housing advisor, who conducted a study and found that Kingston just had a 1.57% vacancy rate. And that should have been the end. But landlords were mobilizing in opposition against the city declaring a housing emergency. And so we had conversations with elected officials. We turned folks out to the Common Council meetings when they were voting on declaring that housing emergency. And then we were able to get that housing emergency declared, but that just kicked off this entire campaign of us working with the Common Council and encouraging folks to apply to be on the Rent Guidelines Board, making sure the right people got appointed, and then engaging with tenants throughout the process to mobilize them to the RGB public hearings. And June can probably talk a bit more about that. But yeah, it's been a long and hard-fought victory. And this really is just one historic and important step, but we still have a long ways to go before we're solving the housing crisis in Kingston.
And it looks like there will be more municipalities opting in the next year or two. There are several upstate municipalities in the pipeline. Tyler, what's happened since July 28th when the Common Council voted to opt into the ETPA, the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, and what's been going on with landlords misbehaving?
Yeah, a lot's been going on since the Common Council first opted in back in July. A lot of tenant organizing and tenant power being shown by the tenants in the ETPA covered buildings, showing out to both of the public hearings that the RGB has set, going multiple, I think over 3 hours, maybe even 4 hours at both of the public hearings, overwhelmingly supporting the rent reduction, almost no landlords speaking. So there's been a lot of organizing in there, a lot of work that we at Citizen Action have been doing with For the Many, mobilizing the tenants. We put together a Know Your Rights workshop that we invited all the tenants, as many tenants as we could, covered in ETPA covered buildings, to come out so they learned what their new rights were to stand up to the predatory practices landlords were doing. While we were recruiting for that, we found that landlords were already trying to get tenants to sign increased rents, and even were before knowing that the vacancy study was already coming in, and kind of reading their cards and knowing that the ETPA adoption was coming in some form. So they were already charging whatever they thought they could get away with, 10, 20, 30% rent increases to tenants before we could even get the word out. So the price gouging was going on until the last minute.
And even after the board voted and the mayor signed the bill, at which point rents were frozen, even after that, landlords were trying to force tenants to sign illegal leases and raising their rents when they were not allowed to raise rents at all.
Right.
And we heard many of examples of that at the September 8th Know Your Rights workshop. So June, you've been doing a lot of organizing, door knocking, helping tenants organize tenants associations. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it has really been an incredible couple of weeks leading up to the hearings that we just had. We had 2 different public hearings, and I'll just pick up from where Tyler left off. So a few months ago, we have For the Many partnered with Citizen Action and hosted an ETPA sort of workshop, informational session, and from there, quite a few tenants came who were really interested in getting started and organizing their building, and that started happening even before we reached out to them. They, as soon as they came to that first informational meeting and sort of learned about this opportunity, organizing started sort of organically. And we sort of, quickly followed up with folks and connected with a lot of tenants at some of these larger complexes. So just to sort of review, there are 1,300 units covered, or roughly 1,300 units covered by the ETPA in Kingston, which is about 22% of housing stock. A lot of, about at least half of these units are within 2 to 3, 4 complexes, right? And then there's a lot of smaller complexes that are covered. So the largest example being Stony Run, that's an apartment complex with 266 units, Dutch Village, which is, in the high hundreds. So we started to organize with tenants in those complexes who were already organizing with one another, and, just sort of stepped in and provided some guidance and some structure, and sort of helped them, create organizing committees, and then plan larger tenant unions. So far we have, already gotten tenant unions sort of starting to get set up in both Stony Run and in Dutch Village, which, are the 2 largest complexes, and hopefully this sort of momentum will sort of continue on, and other tenants and other buildings will start getting themselves organized as well, and hopefully both us and Citizen Action can do everything that we can to support these tenants and provide resources and time and our staff capacity to supporting them start these organizations and starting independent power for themselves ultimately. I think some of the things that really stand out to me about the organizing that we've been doing is just sort of how vile a lot of the conditions that tenants in Kingston, and of course throughout the Hudson Valley and New York State and broadly the country are dealing with. Bravin touched a little bit, and you yourself, Michael, touched upon the increase of rent and the price gouging that was happening even before the city opted in to the ETPA. And we've really seen, sort of an increase in rents happening in the Kingston area, happening pretty dramatically ever since 2017. So it's been about 5 years since this has really kicked off. And I would say in the pandemic, it has gone far, far worse.
You had a lot of people relocating to the Hudson Valley from New York City.
Absolutely. So the Hudson Valley has been one of the sort of the fastest, I guess, growing areas as people have been moving there. A lot of people moving from the city first to get away from living in the city during the pandemic, but then afterwards to, not after the pandemic, but later on to escape the rent hikes that were happening in the city, right? So as we know, rent in New York City is higher than it's ever been on average, and so a lot of tenants there can no longer afford to live there, and so they they try to move upstate. Upstate landlords in Kingston and in other places have sort of recognized this trend, have started price gouging. This was happening again before the pandemic, but really accelerated during it. And I think the other factor, of course, is Airbnb. So, there have been a dramatic increase of Airbnb sort of throughout the Hudson Valley. I think Kingston is one of the worst examples in the country of where we've seen this sort of rapid increase of, vacation rentals as opposed to long-term tenant housing. We have over, roughly 200 Airbnbs in Kingston, and if you go on like apartments.com, it's less than 75, and about a third of those are in Stony Run, right, and other complexes covered by ETPA. So, on top of the price gouging that's been happening and the decreasing of just the housing stock generally, we've also just seen this dereliction of duty when it comes to taking care of these tenants, right? And just keep maintaining a basic livable situation for them. Landlords have realized that this is an extremely profitable market for them. And so there's a lot of flipping happening. So landlords will buy properties, increase rents. Sometimes they'll do some superficial, aesthetic improvements, but sometimes not even that. And then they'll sell it to another owner who will then do the same thing. And it'll sort of this cycle where we have this flipping and then charging cycle. And so ultimately, these landlords don't actually care about the conditions in the buildings because it's not, it doesn't affect the amount of profit they're able to make because of how dramatically the housing, the value of housing has gone up. So yeah, I mean, that is what we have been seeing in terms of conditions. And just to provide some examples, I've talked to tenants whose have human waste coming through their bathtubs, have paint peeling off the walls, have mold having taken over their entire apartments, their couches, their living room, their TV stands. Lots of people have developed breathing conditions or other sorts of medical issues because of the mold that they are forced to live in. Unresponsive management, so we have tenants who have tried to reach out to management again and again and again without any response and have been forced to live in these abominable conditions for many months at a time. And, heartbreakingly, a lot of these tenants are elderly citizens, right? They're people who are well over 70 years old. They don't really have anywhere else to go. And a lot of them are really struggling with knowing what to do. And so I think what has been really promising about the organizing that we have been doing is, this is the first opportunity a lot of these tenants have had to talk to anyone about the things that they're dealing with and for people to actually hear them. And I think also we've, provided an opportunity for tenants to come together and meet one another and share their experiences and get validated from having all these sort of shared horror stories and be able to actually, win changes for themselves and for one another by working together. So I think that has been, both, there's been a lot of horror stories and tragedies that we've been hearing about on a nearly daily basis. But at the same time, I think there's been so much hope and momentum behind this because, this is the first time a lot of these tenants have ever seen an opportunity like this to really, help themselves. So, yeah, that's
mutual support, the safety in numbers.
A long summary, I guess, of what's been going on.
Now, I was very, very impressed with the turnout you guys were able to muster at the 2 hearings of the Kingston Rent Guidelines Board, where there were very few landlords testifying, and none of the big landlords came and spoke. Naturally, only small mom and pop landlords came. But tell us about how you organized and got people. Were people reluctant to speak? Were tenants ready to tell their story? I mean, talk about what went into organizing for those 2 hearings.
Yeah, I think the critical thing that helps tenants feel comfortable with testifying is having the experience of being able to share what they've gone through with one another, right? So we had over 30 tenants come to our first Stony Run tenant union meeting, and lots of people, they all had opportunities to discuss what they had been through. We sort of have had similar experiences at Dutch Village and other places. And so I think once people have heard everyone else's horror stories and understand that it's a problem much larger than themselves, I think, they feel empowered with the numbers that we have to all go together and provide testimony. So I think that is a big reason why we had a lot of people testify who were living at those two complexes, is not because those people were uniquely suffering, right? I think all these tenants are dealing with similar issues. I think ultimately the tenants who came out were people who have been involved with organizing to some degree. But on top of that, we've just been doing everything that we can to talk to as many tenants as possible. So, we've been canvassing all of the complexes, even the smaller ones. We've worked with Citizen Action, with Mid-Hudson Valley DSA, with Housing Justice for All, to canvass a lot of these buildings and talk to tenants about the upcoming hearings. We designed flyers that we distributed to everyone. We sent emails, we did texts, we did phone calls. So we've been working pretty much, around the clock during working hours, that is, to find tenants and to try to turn them out to these meetings. I think the other big thing is having tenant leaders, right, and who are forming these organizing committees in these different complexes to really take the leadership upon themselves to turn one another out and bring their neighbors out to these hearings. I think that was a huge factor in the turnout we had. And, I think just to put some numbers on it, the first hearing, I think there was like 6 landlords and like 20-something, 28 tenants who spoke. And then in the second hearing, we had almost 60 pro-tenant speakers. A few of them were professors and other experts speaking in support of the rent reduction, and only two landlords showed up to that one. So, and additionally, we had dozens of other comments that were emailed in. I think altogether, well over 100 tenants supplied testimony to the Rent Guidelines Board. And this is, of course, out of only 1,300 units that are covered.
It was a great turnout. I mean, at both hearings, so you guys should be really proud. Now, Bravin, did you really think you could get a rent rollback? I mean, when you guys first started strategizing about this, how did you put this campaign together? How did you persuade the board to do this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael. I mean, a rent reduction was what was needed for the tenants that we've been organizing, the people that we've been talking to. And that was very evidently clear to us this whole time. But yeah, I mean, a rent reduction has never happened before. And a lot of us, even those of us who are, tenant advocates and work in housing justice, what we thought was possible was limited by kind of history and the fact that this has never happened before. But once we had known who was appointed to the Rent Guidelines Board, the Kingston Common Council already took bold action this year by passing good cause eviction. They again took bold action by appointing a Rent Guidelines Board that would be responsive to the data and the horror stories that some of which Ajuna described the tenants were facing. And so once it was clear that we had a board that was going to be receptive, it started to be clear to us that we could actually win a reduction. It was very, very many conversations with Rent Guidelines Board members, whether it be tenant allies who were afraid, not knowing if this was possible, talking to yourself and some of the other allies we had at the Housing Justice Coalition who assured us that it was fully in the board's power to do this.
And even the state agency said that, the DHCR attorneys said that the board does have the power to reduce rents. I mean, they said that on the record.
Exactly. Yeah, they have the statutory ability to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Boards in years past just didn't have the political will. But we had the power of tenants that were organizing, bringing them out to hearings. We were having conversations with Rent Guidelines Board members, making it clear to them that a rent reduction was not only necessary to help tenants, but the only reasonable response to the data and the years of rent gouging that people had seen. And all of that together was too much for kind of the landlord opposition to handle. And they tried to scare the board. They tried to issue this nonsense lawsuit a couple weeks ago to try and disband the board. They tried to scare them, but we're happy the board stood strong. They listened to the voices of tenants. We were able to make history.
And you had so much rent gouging. It was unbelievable what the rent increases were in Kingston for the last 5 or 6 years. Tyler, what do you have to say about all of this?
Yeah, a whole lot to say about this, but I think it's important to note too that victory comes on the backs of years and years of housing organizing going back in Kingston. Back in 2019, when Kingston first considered opting into the ETPA, and the only reason they didn't was because landlords weren't honestly responding to studies and making the process muddy. So the vacancy study didn't come back, but the housing organizing has been going on in Kingston since even before then, and until now. So it really made our job a lot easier going out and talking to tenants because they were so eager to go out and tell their story also. Even the property managers that they are working with don't respond to their emails or hear their stories. So their stories and what they're going through goes to the void. So some were very happy to come out and tell their story because no one else would hear it. This is the first time they got to really have someone listen to them for the first time. But that's not to say at all that tenants weren't afraid of the intimidation from their landlords or sharing their story for that reason. So luckily the board did allow the written testimony option to come in, which allowed some of those people to write in their story instead of testifying. But it was a thrilling victory and an overwhelming display of tenant power in Kingston.
And now we have a landlord lawsuit that looks like the Attorney General, Tish James, is going to represent the City of Kingston and the Rent Guidelines Board and the State Division of Housing against the landlords. What's going to happen? I mean, what do you think is going to happen here? Robin, I think that's a question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
you're the political director.
Yeah, well, we can't predict how a lawsuit is going to go, but what I will say is time and time again, we see patterns like this, right? When the democratic will of the people and their elected representatives and the appointed representatives in the Rent Guidelines Board do what's right for our community, landlords and corporate real estate are trying to overturn those democratic processes in order to protect their own profits through these nonsensical lawsuits. And you said to yourself, Michael, the Attorney General herself is going to be defending the Rent Guidelines Board, defending this decision, defending the vacancy study that the city did. And this has happened time and time again, right? In other cities across the state, landlords have tried to sue to overturn Rent Guidelines Board decisions, and they very rarely work. And so we feel really confident about this decision. This decision, again, is rooted in the objective data and the testimony that dozens of tenants provided. It's desperate. The landlords didn't show up to the public hearings. They didn't organize. And now they're trying to defeat us through these bad faith lawsuits. And it's pretty sad, actually. But we feel pretty confident that the decisions of the board is going to stand.
Yeah, one of their claims is that by when the city did the survey, and telling landlords that if they didn't answer that they would assume that there was no vacancies. That's directly on point with the Spring Valley lawsuit from, I believe, 1978, or maybe it was early 80s, where a survey was done by the village of Spring Valley in exactly the same methodology, and that the landlords lost that lawsuit. So if the courts care anything about precedent, they won't listen to that argument. And it seems to me that the survey that was done by the city, this one, the 2022 survey, not the 2019 survey, which the consultant botched, was methodologically very sound. So I can't imagine that they're going to succeed in overturning the declaration of an emergency. And of course, we are now anticipating they might file a second lawsuit to overturn the rent rollback. But that hasn't happened yet. And of course, the courts are closed today, so we'll see what happens on Monday. Well, thank you both. Thank you all three very much. And this has been really very exciting and good work. Congratulations. I mean, this is like everybody in the tenant movement throughout the entire state. Everyone's talking about Kingston.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Michael. You really were instrumental in this process just as much as any of us were. Your expertise in guiding us through even letting us know what was possible was very much needed too. So thank you as well.
I've been working for this for 50 years.
Michael, before we go, would you like us to talk a little bit about our organizations and who we are before we?
Oh, I should have asked you that in the first place. Please tell us about For the Many.
Okay, Pravin, all you.
Yeah, well, We For the Many are a grassroots organization organizing working people, immigrants, students in order to build a Hudson Valley and a New York State that works for all of us by passing laws and winning elections. And one of the most important issues for us is housing justice, because we're in a housing crisis, and it's one of the issues that affects people that we organize the most materially. We also organize around climate and healthcare. I think victories like this, while the work that we do is incredibly hard and we're up against so many wealthy and powerful people, it shows that when we come together, we can win and make history and change the lives of thousands of people.
And you're now trying to get the Kingston Common Council to pass a law to deal with Airbnb and that problem, which
absolutely,
we hope they will do.
Tyler, just getting started.
Tyler, tell us about Citizen Action.
So Citizen Action, we're a statewide member-led grassroots organization. We focus on building community power and community development by encouraging people to take action in the political process, whether electorally or lobbying their leaders to build power in that way, talking to their neighbors and building, whether it's tenants associations or just advocating for their neighborhood in different capacities from there. We work on a variety of different issues, basically what's ever important to the community. So whether that's housing or education in the Hudson Valley or criminal justice or healthcare, whatever it is, if people are interested in working on it, we're going to help them take on that cause across the state.
And full and fair disclosure, I'm a member of Citizen Action too. So anyway, thank you guys a lot, and keep on trucking.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. So grateful to be in this fight with all of you.
Yeah.
Next, we're going to speak with one of the members of the Kingston Common Council, Michelle Hirsch. Michelle Hirsch, welcome to Tenant Action today.
Hi, Michael. Good afternoon. It's good to see you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, so this is quite a big deal. The first rent guidelines board in the state of New York to roll back rents.
I know, it was such an exciting night, and I'm glad that I got to be there for the vote. I had a meeting previous to that, and I came in while they were deliberating. The guidelines board was deliberating, and it seemed pretty tense. And then once they got to a vote that declared the rent rollback and the percentages, and it was just really exciting. And I couldn't sleep that night. I was pretty excited.
Yeah, well, you had a finance meeting where you were talking about a new development that would be for senior citizens and victims of domestic violence. But you got there for the last hour and a half, and it was a meeting that lasted almost 4 hours. So,
I know, and then the hearing too. The previous Saturday was about 5 hours long. So
yeah. Now you have been incredibly helpful to the tenants in Kingston in terms of organizing and giving them political support. And this is your first term on the Common Council, I believe.
No, it's actually my second term. I'm in my second term. They're 2-year terms. So I took office January 1st, 2020. Okay,
right after the 2019 vote on ETPA.
Well, actually, when I took office, we were still waiting on the survey, the first survey.
Right.
And waiting with bated breath. And I was really excited to come on. I campaigned on housing. I ran because of housing issues. And so I was really excited to come on board and, vote for the, declare a housing emergency. And the survey came back, and it did not indicate that we had a housing emergency. I believe it was false. Absolutely false.
You basically wasted $30,000 on these consultants.
Yeah, we threw it down the toilet.
Right. And everyone knew that there was no way that this result could be, anything approaching reality in terms of the Kingston rental market, where they found that the vacancy rate was almost 7%, and anything above 5% makes it impossible for Kingston to declare a housing emergency. But then the city itself did a survey earlier this year and found that it was 1.57, I believe.
Correct.
A very, very tight market, which is consistent with everything we know about what's happening with rental housing. Now, motivated you to run for the Common Council in the first place?
Well, I work in human services, and I work with local families here in Kingston who have children experiencing mental health issues. And I work as part of a team to help stabilize the family. And it was coming up repeatedly. The number one reason we have issues stabilizing families was we couldn't find them housing. And I had a lot of families going into emergency housing where the kids were getting bused back into Kingston from distances far away. And so it was impacting the families, impacting the kids. It's impacting our school districts in a negative way. You're going to have underperforming school districts when you don't have families stably housed. We're not going to have, results that we need to be a successful school district and, bring in jobs and bring in industry.
Well, and certainly that is, you have been working on those issues since you were elected. Now, you were very instrumental in recruiting members of the Rent Guidelines Board, and the process was very open and transparent, where I think something like 25 residents of Kingston applied for membership where there were 9 positions on the board. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the first time that we were hoping to declare the housing emergency, I had actually read the state statute and was keeping ahead of what's coming next, what should we be prepared for. And at that time I had read about seating the Rent Guidelines Board and having that the local legislative body would have to pick the names. So we didn't get to do that last time, but I remembered, how that was supposed to roll out. And I really pushed for it to be done correctly, making sure that we had our hearings and that the council, the local legislative body, was the one picking the board. I just really wanted to be mindful of all procedural pieces of the process, and so that if we were to be sued, it could hold up.
Which you were guaranteed to be sued. I mean,
we're going to get sued.
Always sued. Almost guaranteed. So, and then you had all these people applying, and then I gather one of the committees screened the candidates and interviewed candidates.
Yes. So the Laws and Rules Committee vetted the list, and we deliberated for quite a while, going through the names. And I had done all my research on all of the names, and I just really wanted to make sure that we had a real tenant-friendly board. I don't feel like our community is very tenant-friendly. I feel like there's a lot of special interests that are beholden to, in government here, politics, they're beholden to the real estate industry. So it was important that we have a good, diverse group that would be sympathetic to tenants and not treat them like a commodity the way they've been treated here in Kingston.
And it's unfortunate that the state law is restrictive in the sense that smaller buildings and newer buildings are not eligible to be covered by the rent law. And we're hoping eventually to change that. But right now, ETPA applies only to buildings with 6 or more units that were built before 1974. So that adds up to about 22% of the rental housing in Kingston, which means a lot of tenants don't have the protections of rent regulation. But you did earlier this year enact good cause eviction, which even though it seems from what I've heard the courts are not recognizing it, eventually tenants in those smaller buildings will have a defense if the landlord tries to evict them without a reason or raise their rent unrealistically or unjustly. But so it's, but it's nevertheless a very big deal that Kingston was the first municipality north of Rockland County to actually opt into the statewide system. So you picked, and certainly the board members that the Common Council picked, the tenant members are very strong tenant advocates. The 2 landlord members are certainly advocating for the people they're representing, the landlords. They were quite aggressive the other night during the vote, opposing what the majority of the board was planning on doing. And the public members seem to be very serious and focused on the data and the process. And the meeting went on almost 4 hours, and it was very, very substantive. So I think, the landlords are going to have a hard time overturning this in court, but then you never know what's going to happen with the courts. And this is the third department in the 4 departments of the city. And up until now, rent regulation only existed in the first and second departments. So all of the judges from, Westchester and Rockland County North, they don't know anything about this. They probably haven't had a rent control case come before them since probably the 1960s when you had state rent control. But none of those judges were there back then. So it's going to take some doing for the upstate judges to actually understand and get used to and abide by these changes in the laws. And what we've seen at 58 Fair Street, which is this 7-unit building that is now covered by the Emergency Tenant Protection Act, and the tenants are protected from arbitrary eviction. When they went to court in August, and they tried to get an attorney, but they were not able to get an attorney, they first asked the city judge for an adjournment so they could get an attorney. The judge refused. And then they tried to raise the defense of good cause eviction. And I'm told the judge said, I don't want to hear about that, even though it is law. And this is your city court. So this all goes slowly. It takes time for things to get implemented and to get adjusted. And we finally found an attorney to represent the tenants in that building and stop the evictions, which were scheduled to start happening as early as November 18th. So
yeah, there's so much, the landlords aren't informing their tenants that they're now in, rent stabilized building. And so when a lot of those tenants went to court, they weren't aware yet that their building actually was protected. And I had pushed to have the city do a mailing even to all the apartments in the city, just to make sure that tenants were aware if they were not going to receive this news from their landlord. I felt that if the city was going to pass this law, the city should be informing them.
Well, and it's good that you did that mailing. And of course, my experience with my many trips to Kingston in the last few months is that tenants are very confused. They still are, maybe a little less now than they were 2 months ago. They're getting very conflicting advice. I'm telling them one thing, the attorneys from DHCR are telling them another. Members of the Common Council are doing the best they can to learn what these laws provide and to tell people what to do. The organizers from For the Many and Citizen Action are learning real fast, and they're becoming quite expert. But at the beginning, they didn't know either. This is all brand new subject matter. And I've come to realize that we, the statewide tenant movement, we were not really prepared for this. We did not have the infrastructure in place that would have made it possible to come in with real resources and avoid the kind of things that landlords were getting away with back in August and September. And now tenants are going to have to file overcharge complaints in some cases. They're going to have to file fair market rent appeals, and they're going to have to challenge the initial apartment registration, which landlords are starting to serve on them. And this is no one's going to tell them what to do unless the local organizers do. So we're preparing materials, and we're planning a bunch of workshops with Citizen Action and For the Many. So what do you think is the future of affordable housing in Kingston and in Ulster County? I mean, I know the Common Council has dealt with a few, housing production issues, but, I don't think there's any way to build our way out of this crisis overnight. I mean, it's going to take a lot to.
No, everything that's planned right now for new buildings isn't going to go online for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And I just think that the more regulations that we can put in, like good cause eviction, or if that's not going to hold, maybe expanding ETPA to be more inclusive of newer buildings, built after 1974. Because like you said earlier, we still have about 80% of our housing stock that isn't covered. And it's, I think it's the regulations that tenants here in Kingston need. They have the right to renew and protections, on overcharges, and a lot of the predatory things that we've been seeing here in Kingston would not be allowed under the ETPA.
Right. Michelle, thank you so much. And
thank you. Thank you for all your help and your wisdom through this.
But anyway, thanks so much, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.
Okay. Finally, we're going to talk to the 2 tenant members of the Kingston Rent Guidelines Board, Carolina Soto and Michael Tierney. Carolina, Michael, welcome to Tenant Action Today.
Happy to be here.
You guys must feel pretty proud of yourselves, having won the first rent rollback in the history of the entire rent stabilization system in New York State.
It is totally exciting.
Yeah, I'm just.
Oh, please, Michael. I prefer that when you speak.
Yeah, I'm just over the world with it. I've had people, in my building come up to me and be like, "What does this mean?" But I see it in the paper and I see your name attached to it, and it's a lot of explaining, but it feels really good, and I think we'll really start to see some improvements in our community right away with it.
Now, you've both been tenants in Kingston for a period of time, and you have observed what's happened in the market in Kingston in the last 5, 6, 7 years, especially since the pandemic hit. Tell us about, what you've experienced and what you've seen with your fellow tenants, as the rent pressure keeps going up and the housing supply gets tighter.
Well, I was originally looking for a house, but I was priced out of the market pretty quickly. And as soon as COVID happened, the market went crazy. And it seemed that way with apartments as well, because every time we would be looking for an apartment, people would be telling us, yes, this is the new Brooklyn. It's we're just hitting stride with market value. And it was really very difficult. We were looking at things that I thought, well, if I was applying for an apartment on the Upper West Side, I'd be considering this kind of money. But in Kingston, I wasn't expecting this kind of market at all. And so when I did find a place that was really cheap, it was really what I would call substandard. The floors were all chewed up, and the joint taping on the ceiling was bad, and the carpet was dingy and dirty, which I made them come and clean several times because they told me it was going to look like new, and of course it didn't. And the price was something that I could afford, but the place was not what I really wanted. And so we were thinking, maybe this is a temporary place. Maybe it's something that we can hold on to for a while. But I think we've always been looking to see if we could find something better. Mm-hmm. It was just because the conditions were bad, and right away the first year they asked for a 10% increase, and
after a year. You mean after your
after
first year?
1 year, they asked for a 10% increase, and you're looking around saying, I've asked them to fix the door in the bathroom where my guest was locked into the bathroom because the knobs were these very cute decorative things with gold foil in them from the 60s, but evidently the person that came to fix them said, oh yeah, we've had a lot of problems with these, a lot of problems. And we ended up having to break into we broke the molding around the door to get him out. Yeah.
Well, and your
And
complex run has
it took
turned over a
6
lot.
months. It took 6 months to get that molding replaced, and they never came and plastered the wall. Finally, I just said, let me just go out and buy some spackle, and I spackled it up and painted it so that, I would have my bathroom back again.
Right. And your complex Stony Run has turned over a lot. It's been sold and flipped, and now and it's been one predatory, speculative landlord after another. So, what about your
I
place?
didn't think.
Sorry.
I just didn't think that it could get worse after the first landlord.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I moved here to this apartment a year or 2 years ago, and it's a very nice place. I got it because I was able to walk to work. That was something that was really important to me. But as we discussed in the green room, if it starts to rain, this window leaks. I've sent videos to my landlord about it, like with a stream of water flowing through it, and they've never come. I put all of my plants here so they get watered because we're so that's my way of fixing the problem so it doesn't damage the floors or the window. Most of my outlets in my kitchen don't work. The parking lot, which finally did get paved yesterday, would always have like a foot of water in it whenever it rained, and it was definitely damaging everybody's vehicles. But to speak to the larger experiences of people in Kingston, up until September of this year, I worked in the district office of one of our elected officials, and I would say a majority of of the issues that people would come in complaining about or need addressing would be like constituent issues. My landlord is, trying to illegally evict me during the eviction moratorium. He's not even applying with ERAP, because he wants me gone. So he's not doing his half of the emergency rental assistance program. My landlord is, I think he's trying to get the building inspector to file an uninhabitable, cite the property as uninhabitable, so we're forced to leave. There's all these kind of methods that have been used to sort of trample over, people in the city of Kingston and in Ulster County at large. We have a severe housing problem. All of our DSS motels are filled up right now. There's just, I'm so glad we achieved this victory, but there's so much more work to be done.
Right. So what motivated the two of you to apply for membership on the Rent Guidelines Board? Carolina.
It was the poison pen letter from the landlord. He said, I was aware, because I read the newspapers, I was aware that there was a rent freeze on, and I received a letter on August 6th that said, for my December 1st rent, that if I sign this letter before August 20th, I could have an 18% increase. If I didn't sign it before August 20th, I could have a 30% increase. And if I didn't sign by October 31st, that it would go to what they called market value, which was $2,200 a month, which is not market value for an apartment like this. I think I'm lucky in that I have an apartment that is okay. It's basically sound. I'm not experiencing the mold that my neighbors are, or our building is fairly dry. What we do have is we have sewage backup. So sometimes the smell coming from the bathroom wakes me up in the middle of the night. But the treatment by the landlord was so terrible that I called Barbara Hill, who was our alderwoman, and she had been here campaigning, and we struck up a nice conversation. She stayed almost a half an hour in our house, and I felt I had a personal connection. So I called Barbara, and she said, I really would like it if you applied for the Rent Guidelines Board. she said, I think you should get as many people from Stony Run to apply as possible. And you should, it will send a clear signal that people from Stony Run are really upset with their landlord.
And this letter you received was at a time when rents were legally frozen because
completely frozen.
Yeah,
yes.
and the landlords were not allowed to raise rents, and they certainly were not allowed to say what the rent increase was going to be when your lease came up for renewal, because that would be up to the vote of the Rent Guidelines Board. Yeah. And what about you, Michael? What was your?
Mikey,
My motivation for joining the board really started, back in 2019 with the original flawed, when the city originally decided to have a survey that had this particularly flawed methodology of not asking tenants, just sort of blindly trusting landlords to report on something that may financially impact them. So that was when it started. I was very critical when the survey came out. And so I was very excited when we had this new one. And I also, I spoke with one of my friends who's on the city council, Michelle Hirsch, for the 9th Ward. And she recommended that I apply when the time comes. And I was thinking about it, but the real final moment was I went to go and pay my rent and sign a new lease for the next year. My lease was up August 1. And I had to be the one to tell my property manager that we opted, that the city is covered under ETPA. You can't raise my rent.
You can't raise your rent, right?
It was like a 45-minute conversation where I was explaining to them the law, and they were saying, well, we have to talk to the attorneys. You'll hear from the attorneys. And it's like, why you weren't, I fire those attorneys because they should have told you this 2 weeks ago that this was happening.
Yeah. Oh, well,
so that was really the final one. Like
that was the last straw. Right. So talk about just for a couple of minutes that we have left. Let's talk about what happened at the meeting when you voted for the 15% rollback. This meeting went on for like 4 hours almost, on very uncomfortable wooden benches that we had to all sit through for 4 hours. Tell us a little bit about, how you felt about that. You started out asking for 30% rent rollback. The chair proposed 5%. One of the landlord members proposed a positive 5% rent increase, which even the other landlord member would not support. She was the only one who was in favor of that. And you ended up with 15% rent rollback.
So I think we would have to go back to, we had a 4-hour meeting, and we also have probably had a cumulative total of 8 hours of public hearing. And the human-derived data of the near 130 people who have given public comment in those 2 hearings as well as online almost universally said we need a significant rent reduction. Mm-hmm. And so it was, Carolina and I felt that it was our obligation to come in with a substantial rent reduction. And we heard from time and time again from these public comments, from, comments from academics, from community service organizations, from legal services of the Hudson Valley, that all, larger steps than just a freeze would be required. Mm-hmm. So I think that, that guided our principle, that we had significant amount of data, of human connection, of public comments, our own personal experiences saying that we need to come in with a very large ask. And I am pleased that we got 15. That was so important. And I'm so grateful that, most of the public members of the board recognized the needs of tenants, including our chairman. And so it was a real team effort, and it was a real deliberation.
Well, congratulations, because you both did a great job. I mean, I have to say, for a first meeting, which, is first time you do this, it's got to be difficult and nervous making, but you both did very well. And my hat is off to you. And I want to thank you for participating in this interview, and we will be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You've been watching Tenant Action Today. We're on every Wednesday at 6 o'clock on Manhattan Neighborhood Network Community Channel and Manhattan Neighborhood Network High Definition channel. Thanks for watching, and please tune in again.